The penthouse of the Obsidian doesn't just overlook the city. It ignores it. From the 68th floor, the world below is reduced to a silent grid of flickering lights and insignificant movements. It's the kind of silence that costs $80 million to buy, and yet, it was the loudest thing in my life. I sat at the glass-top dining table, my hands resting flat on the cool surface, watching the man who had spent the last decade convincing me I was a secondary character in my own story. Arthur didn't look like a man who moved billions through shadow accounts. He looked like the personification of American trust, silver-haired, impeccably tailored, and possessing a smile that suggested he knew a secret you'd be lucky to hear. He was currently swirling a vintage Bordeaux, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows catching the deep red of the wine. "You're overthinking it again, Jonathan," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "It's a simple procurement oversight. Don't let your nerves get the better of your utility." That was his signature. Whenever I pointed out a discrepancy in the logistics of his latest development project, he didn't argue facts. He attacked my temperament. He framed my professional diligence as an emotional weakness. In Arthur's world, to be concerned was to be fragile. To ask questions was to be unsteady. I had been his head of acquisitions for 12 years. I was the one who scouted the land, navigated the zoning laws, and shook the hands that needed shaking. But in the press releases, I was the valued associate. In the boardroom, I was the man who managed the details, while Arthur built the vision. "The site on 57th is cleared," I said quietly, ignoring the jab. "But there's a vehicle blocking the primary egress. A white van. It's been there for months, Arthur. The subcontractors say it isn't theirs. Security says the same. It is attracting attention from the Department of Finance because of the proximity to the fire main." Arthur set his glass down with a deliberate, soft clink. He didn't look at me. He looked through me, out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip. "Jonathan," he whispered, a thin smile playing on his lips. "You have such a marvelous talent for focusing on the dust while the cathedral is rising. It's a van, a piece of urban debris. Let the city deal with its own trash. Your job is to ensure the capital flow remains unobstructed. Can you manage that, or do I need to find someone with a bit of perspective?" I watched the way his thumb traced the rim of his glass. It was a dismissive gesture he'd used 1,000 times. It was the same gesture he used when he redirected $500 million into a management trust. I wasn't allowed to audit. It was the gesture of a man who believed that because he owned the skyline, he owned the ground beneath it, too. I stayed silent. I had learned years ago that providing Arthur with a reaction was like giving him a weapon. Instead, I observed the slight tremor in his left hand, the only part of him that didn't seem to believe his own lies. "I'll handle the capital flow," I said. My voice was level, devoid of the irritation he was fishing for. "Good man," he replied, already turning back to his monitor, dismissing me without a second glance. "And, Jonathan, try to get some sleep. You look tired. It's affecting your aura." I walked out of the penthouse, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of my footsteps. I didn't go to my car. Instead, I walked 3 blocks over to 57th Street. The Obsidian was a skeleton of steel and ambition, a monument to Arthur's vision. And there, hunkered against the curb like a stubborn gargoyle, was the van. It was a rusted 2004 Ford Econoline. It was ugly. It was out of place. It was a jagged tear in the fabric of Arthur's perfect, controlled reality. I stood on the sidewalk, my hands in my pockets, watching a traffic enforcement officer stop by the vehicle. He looked at the windshield, then at his handheld device. He frowned. He tried to scan the registration sticker, but the device didn't beep. He tried again. Then, he pulled out a radio and called for a supervisor. I didn't move. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle in my chest. For years, I had been the one smoothing over the cracks in Arthur's empire, fixing the oversights, and ignoring the phantom entities that appeared on the ledges. I had been the silent architect of his invincibility. But as I watched the officer walk around the van, shaking his head in confusion, I realized that the greatest weakness of a man who controls everything is the one thing he deems too small to notice. The van was a ghost, and in a world of billion-dollar shadows, a ghost is the only thing that can leave a footprint. I looked up at the top floor of the Obsidian. The lights were on. Arthur was up there, sipping his wine, convinced that he had managed to be, once again. He thought my silence was submission. He thought my patience was a lack of ambition. He was wrong. My silence was simply an observation period, and I had seen enough. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I didn't call Arthur. I didn't call the site manager. I opened a private browser and began a search that had nothing to do with real estate and everything to do with the specific internal coding of the city's towing database. Code 000, I whispered to myself, remembering a fragment of a conversation I'd overheard in Arthur's office months ago. Sovereign entity. The officer was now calling for a heavy-duty tow truck. He looked frustrated. He didn't realize he was about to pull a thread that was connected to the foundation of the very building he was standing in front of. I walked away before the tow truck arrived. I needed to go home. I needed to look at the ledgers one last time, not to fix the mistakes, but to ensure they were exactly where they needed to be. Arthur always told me I was too focused on the details. Perhaps he was right. The grand opening of the sales suite for the Obsidian was less of a business event and more of a coronation. Arthur had spent $3 million on the catering alone. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying metallic temps of new construction. I stood near the periphery, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, watching the city's elite orbit Arthur-like planets around a dying sun. He was in his element. He moved through the crowd with a predatory grace, touching elbows, leaning in to whisper secrets, and throwing his head back in that rehearsed, booming laugh that made everyone else feel like they were part of an inner circle. I had spent the last 72 hours looking at the internal ledger for the Obsidian Utility Trust. It was a document I wasn't supposed to have access to, but Arthur's arrogance was his own digital undoing. He used the same password for his offshore accounts that he used for his wine cellar inventory. It was a date the day he closed his first $10 million deal. To him, it was a lucky number. To me, it was a key. What I found wasn't just money laundering. It was a masterpiece of architectural fraud. The utility trust wasn't paying for electricity or water. It was paying maintenance fees to a company called Apex Logistics, the same company that owned the rusted white van currently sitting in a city impound lot. Jonathan, there he is. The man who counts the bolts, so I don't have to. Arthur's voice cut through my thoughts. He had approached me with a group of potential investors, men with tan skin and teeth that cost more than my first car. He draped an arm over my shoulder, a gesture that felt less like camaraderie and more like a physical claim of ownership. We were just discussing the penthouse finishes, Arthur said, turning to the investors. I told them we're using Italian marble from a quarry I personally vetted. Jonathan here was worried about the shipping costs. He's always worried about the costs, aren't you, John? It's a charmingly middle-class trait. The investors chuckled. It was a light, polite sound, but it carried the sting of 1,000 small humiliations. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I kept my face a mask of professional neutrality. The marble is exceptional, Arthur, I said quietly. But the logistics of the Apex deliveries were what I was actually reviewing this morning. There seems to be a discrepancy in the transit times. The name Apex hung in the air for a fraction of a second too long. I felt Arthur's fingers tighten on my shoulders just a twitch, a momentary loss of that legendary composure. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes turned into chips of blue ice. Logistics, Arthur repeated, his voice dropping an octave. Always the logistics. You see, gentlemen, this is why you hire a man like Jonathan. He stays in the basement so he can enjoy the view. He's the ballast that keeps the ship steady, even if he doesn't quite understand where the ship is sailing. He turned back to me, his face inches from mine. The smell of his expensive cologne was suffocating. Go check on the coat check, would you? He whispered, loud enough for the investors to hear. The governor is arriving in 10 minutes, and I don't want him waiting for his scarf. It's a detail I'm sure you can handle. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was an erasure. In front of the people who mattered most to his empire, he had reduced a decade of my labor to the level of a valet. I looked at him, searching for even a flicker of hesitation, but there was only the cold, hard vacuum of his ego. Of course, Arthur, I said. I walked away. I didn't go to the coat check. I walked out of the sales suite, through the heavy glass doors, and into the cool night air of 57th Street. The spot where the van had been was now empty. Only a rectangular patch of oil and grime remained on the asphalt, a dark blemish on the otherwise pristine street. I stood there for a long time, looking at that stain. Arthur thought he was the architect. He thought he was building a legacy that would outlive us all. But a building is only as strong as its foundation, and Arthur's foundation was built on a code 000 ghost. I pulled out my phone. I had a contact at the Department of Finance, a woman named Sarah, who I'd helped with the zoning issue years ago. She owed me a favor. I sent her a short encrypted message. The Econoline of the 12th Street impound. Check the van against the federal bypass list. It's not a diplomatic vehicle. It's a server node. My thumb hovered over the send button. I thought about the last 12 years. I thought about the weekends I'd missed with my family, the late nights spent fixing Arthur's procurement oversights, and the way he had just told the world I was nothing more than a glorified servant. I realized then that I wasn't angry. Anger is a reactive emotion. It's loud and messy and easy to predict. What I felt was a profound, quiet clarity. Arthur hadn't just betrayed me. He had miscalculated me. He had assumed that because I was quiet, I was hollow. He had assumed that because I was patient, I was stagnant. I pressed send. The message vanished into the digital ether. Within minutes, the tow record for a rusted white Vanna record that should have been voided by a high-level digital handshake would be flagged for manual review. The sovereign entity status would trigger a red flag in the Treasury's Financial Crimes Unit. The thread had been pulled. I walked back inside the sales suite. The governor had arrived. Arthur was standing center stage, a microphone in his hand, preparing to give a speech about the future of the New York skyline. I stood in the back, near the code check he'd sent me to manage. I watched him speak. He looked magnificent. He looked invincible. He looked like a man who had everything under control. And finally, Arthur said, his voice echoing through the marble hall, "I want to thank my team, especially those who work behind the scenes, to ensure that the Obsidian isn't just a building, but a symbol of what can be achieved when you refuse to settle for anything less than perfection." He looked directly at me then. He raised his glass in a mock toast, a tiny, condescending smirk playing on his lips. I didn't toast back. I didn't smile. I just nodded a single, slow acknowledgement. I knew something Arthur didn't. I knew that the perfection he was so proud of was currently being dismantled in an impound lot by a technician with a screwdriver and a laptop. I knew that the Apex server inside that van was currently being decrypted, revealing the web of shell companies, offshore trusts, and illegal wire transfers that funded every inch of the marble he was standing on. Arthur thought he was the one holding the leash. He didn't realize that I was the one who had just opened the gate. As the applause swelled and the cameras flashed, I realized that this was the last time the world would see Arthur like this. He was a dead man walking. He just hadn't felt the cold yet. I turned and walked toward the exit. I had a lot of paperwork to organize before morning. The morning after the gala, the world felt unnervingly still. I woke up at 4:30 a.m., not out of anxiety, but out of a rhythmic necessity. My apartment, a modest brownstone in Brooklyn that Arthur always joked, was quaintly subterranean, was filled with the soft gray light of a city that hadn't quite decided to wake up yet. I made coffee. I sat at my wooden kitchen table. And then, I opened my personal laptop, not the one issued by the Obsidian Group. For the next 4 hours, I didn't move. I wasn't looking for new evidence. I was curating the collapse. I had been downloading fragments of the Apex ledgers for months, tucking them away in encrypted subfolders labeled as 2019 HVAC receipts and plumbing schematics. Arthur never checked the boring files. He lived for the high-octane negotiations and the 8-figure wire transfers. He trusted me to handle the dull stuff, and in doing so, he had handed me the blueprint to his own prison. The realization that Arthur was a fraud hadn't come to me in a flash of lightning. It had been a slow, agonizing erosion over a decade. It was the way he'd asked me to backdate a signature on a zoning permit. It was the consulting fees paid to offshore entities that didn't have a phone number. It was the way he'd look at a map of a low-income neighborhood and call it unrealized capital. But the white van, that was the point of no return. I had discovered the server inside the Econoline 3 months ago during a late-night site visit. I'd seen a man in a nondescript gray jumpsuit entering the van with a ruggedized laptop. I didn't report it to Arthur. I followed the cables. They didn't go to the city's power grid. They went directly into the basement of the Obsidian, spliced into the backup generator circuit. Arthur wasn't just laundering money through real estate. He was hosting a dark web financial node. The building wasn't just a luxury Jerez. It was a physical fortress for a digital shadow bank. By using code 00 license plates reserved for high-level, diplomatic or federal vehicles, he had ensured the van wouldn't be touched by standard meter maids. He had gambled on the city's bureaucracy being too lazy to check. And he would have won if he hadn't treated me like a footstool in front of the governor. At 9 a.m., I walked into the office. The air was different today. There was a frantic energy in the hallways. Assistants were scurrying with stacks of papers, and the usual hum of confident deal-making had been replaced by a sharp, staccato tension. I walked past Arthur's glass-walled office. He was on the phone, his face a shade of mottled red I'd never seen before. He was pacing, his hand running through his silver hair, ruining the perfect coif he'd debuted at the gala. "What do you mean it's not in the system?" He barked into the receiver. "It's a protected asset. Call the commissioner." "No, I don't care what time it is." He saw me through the glass and signaled for me to come in. I took my time. I set my briefcase down, straightened my tie, and walked in with the calm of a man watching a storm from behind reinforced glass. Jonathan, thank God, Arthur said, slamming the phone down. There's a logistical hiccup. The logistics van, the one on 57th. It's been towed, and the impound lot is claiming they can't release it because the van is flagged by the Treasury. He looked at me, waiting for me to jump into action, waiting for me to offer a solution, a bribe, or a legal loophole. That's unfortunate, Arthur, I said. My voice was as smooth as Riverstone. I mentioned the van was attracting attention. Don't give me "I told you so," he snapped, his eyes bulging. I need you to go down there. Use the Apex authorization codes. Tell them it's a federal subcontracting vehicle. Do whatever you have to do to get that server out of the back before they bring in a technician. I looked at him for a long beat. I noticed the way his expensive silk tie was slightly crooked. He looked small. For the first time in 12 years, the Titan of the skyline looked like a man who was afraid of a rusted Ford Econoline. I'm afraid I can't do that, Arthur, I said. He froze. The silence in the room became heavy, pressurized. Excuse me. The Apex codes have been deactivated, I said, lying with a precision that felt like art. I tried to access the portal this morning to check the shipping manifests you asked for. The system is locked out. It seems the Code Zero status triggered an automatic audit of all associated entities. Arthur sank into his leather chair. The bravado leaked out of him like air from a punctured tire. An audit. Now. We're 3 weeks from the final inspection on the penthouse. It's more than an audit, I continued, stepping closer to his desk. I didn't sit. I wanted him to have to look up at me. I took the liberty of calling our contact at the Department of Finance. They mentioned something about the National Security Division. Apparently, hosting an unauthorized satellite uplink on a construction site is a felony. Arthur's face went from red to a sickly, pale gray. How do you know about the uplink? I'm the head of acquisitions, Arthur, I said quietly. I handled the details. You told me that yourself, repeatedly. You told the governor that, too. I was just doing what I was told. I was focusing on the dust. The irony hit him like a physical blow. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing slightly. He was trying to figure out if I was being helpful or if I was the one who had tightened the noose. But I had spent 12 years being his loyal, quiet associate. He couldn't conceive of me as a threat. To him, I was a piece of office furniture that had suddenly started speaking in riddles. You need to fix this, Jonathan, he whispered, his voice trembling. If they get into that server, if they see the Apex transfers to the Cayman accounts, we're both finished. You signed those procurement orders too. You're in this as deep as I am. This was his final move, the mutually assured destruction tactic. He thought that by tethering my fate to his, he could force my hand. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, silver thumb drive. I placed it on the desk between us. That's not true, Arthur, I said. I never signed the Apex orders. I flagged them as pending review in the system every single month. You were so busy celebrating your vision that you never noticed I was bypassing the digital signature. I kept a separate log of every time you manually overrode my objections. Arthur looked at the thumb drive as if it were a poisonous snake. I've spent the last 3 months preparing for this day, I said. Every wire transfer, every shell company, every Code Zero violation. It's all documented, and it's all tied to your personal biometric override. Why? Arthur breathed. After everything I gave you, the salary, the status, you didn't give me anything, Arthur interrupted. You bought my silence and expected me to be grateful for the crumbs. You tried to erase me in my own life. You thought because I didn't shout, I didn't have a voice. But silence isn't a lack of sound. It's a space where you can hear everything the other person is hiding. I turned to the door. Where are you going? He shouted, his voice cracking. Jonathan, get back here. We can talk about this. I'll give you a partnership. 20%. 50. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked out of the office, through the lobby, and out into the bright, indifferent sunlight of the street. I knew that in exactly 4 hours, a fleet of black SUVs would pull up to the curb. I knew that the sovereign entity that Arthur had hidden behind was about to become his judge and jury. As for me, I had a train to catch. I wasn't going far. Just a small house in the Hudson Valley I'd bought under my mother's maiden name 3 years ago. It didn't have a view of the skyline. It didn't have marble floors. But it had something Arthur would never understand. It had a foundation that wasn't built on a lie. I walked toward the subway, my steps light and purposeful. The world was moving again. The grid of lights was flickering. And for the first time in a decade, I wasn't a secondary character. I was the one who had finished the story. I felt a vibration in my pocket. A text from Sarah at the Department of Finance. They just cracked the encryption. It's bigger than we thought. Are you safe? I deleted the message. I didn't need to answer. Arthur had always said I was a man of detail. He just never realized that the most important detail was the one he'd have forgotten to pay for. My loyalty. The train arrived. I stepped on. The doors closed with a hiss, sealing out the noise of the city Arthur thought he owned. The collapse of an empire doesn't sound like a bomb going off. It sounds like a phone that won't stop vibrating on a bedside table. I spent the first 48 hours of Arthur's demise in a small cottage in Cold Spring, 3 towns north of the city's frantic pulse. I sat on a porch that smelled of damp pine and aging cedar, watching the fog roll off the Hudson River. My phone was off, tucked into a kitchen drawer next to a stack of menus I'd never use. I didn't need the news to tell me what was happening. I could feel the tectonic plates shifting. When I finally turned the device back on, it nearly froze under the weight of the data. 142 missed calls, 300 messages. The first dozen were from Arthur, varying from blistering rage to pathetic, whimpering pleas. The rest were from the vultures, lawyers, board members, and journalists who had spent years feeding at Arthur's table and were now terrified they were on the menu. The headline on the New York Times app was a masterpiece of understatement. Federal authorities seized the Obsidian in sweeping racketeering probe. Below it was a photograph that I knew would be etched into the city's history. It wasn't a photo of Arthur in handcuffs. It was a photo of that rusted white van, hoisted high in the air by a police crane, looking like a dead whale being pulled from the ocean. The caption mentioned a phantom entity and a mobile server node that had acted as a digital gateway for $3 billion in laundered capital. Arthur's face was the second photo. He looked unrecognizable. He had been caught by the cameras as he was being led out of his penthouse at 3 a.m. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a gray tracksuit, his hair matted, his eyes wide and vacant. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized that the air he'd been breathing for 12 years was actually a vacuum. The confusion for Arthur wouldn't be what happened, but how. He would spend the next week in a holding cell, his high-priced lawyers whispering in his ear about unauthorized access and rogue employees. But every time they tried to point the finger at me, they hit a brick wall of their own making. Because I hadn't stolen anything. I hadn't hacked him. I had simply stopped protecting him. I went back into the city 5 days later. I didn't go to the office. The office was wrapped in yellow evidence tape and crawling with guys in windbreakers that said IRSCI. I went to a small, nondescript diner for blocks away there. Kind of place where the coffee's burnt and no one asks for your name. I was waiting for Marcus, the board's chief legal counsel. He had been Arthur's primary enabler, the man who drafted the contracts that turned crimes into complex financial instruments. When Marcus walked in, he looked like he'd aged a decade. The confidence that usually radiated from his expensive dentistry had evaporated. He sat down across from me and didn't even look at the menu. "He's asking for you, Jonathan," Marcus said, his voice raspy, in his cell. "He keeps saying you're the only one who can explain the Apex logs. He thinks there's been a mistake. He thinks you'll have the correct version of the files." I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was terrible. The files are correct, Marcus. That's the problem. They're the most honest things in Arthur's life. Marcus leaned in, his eyes darting toward the door. "Listen to me. The board is looking for a scapegoat. They want to pin the server node on you. They're saying you managed the site logistics, that you brought the van in without Arthur's knowledge. If you cooperate with us, if you give us something to use against the feds, we can make sure you're retaken care of." I looked at Marcus with a pity that felt like ice. This was the habit Arthur had taught them all. The belief that everyone has a price, and that loyalty is just a negotiation that hasn't finished yet. "I've already cooperated, Marcus," I said quietly. The color drained from his face. "What?" "I met with the National Security Division 3 weeks ago," I said, "before the van was ever towed. I didn't give them something to use. I gave them everything. The biometric overrides, the shell company registrations in the Cook Islands, the wire transfer timestamps that match Arthur's personal login." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, manila envelope. I slid it across the table. "That's a copy of my immunity agreement," I said, "and a list of the documents I flagged for the SEC over the last 5 years. You'll notice your signatures on the 2022 tax indemnification forms. Marcus, the ones that claim Apex Logistics was a domestic construction vendor." Marcus didn't open the envelope. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was inside. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a valued associate or a quiet detail man. He saw the person who had been documenting his downfall while he was busy deciding which yacht to charter. "You've been doing this for years," he whispered, "while you were sitting in our meetings, while you were taking the bonuses." "I didn't take the bonuses," I corrected him. "I put them into an escrow account for the victims of the gentrification fund Arthur used to clear the site for the Obsidian. I have you untouched a cent of Arthur's money since the day I realized what the van was for." I stood up. I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest, the absence of the weight I'd been carrying for a decade. "Why didn't you just leave?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "If you hated him that much, why stay?" I looked at the oil stain on the floor of the diner, reminding me of the stain the van had left on 57th Street. "Because if I had left, he would have replaced me with someone like you," I said, "and the van would still be parked there. The empire would still be rising. Sometimes, Marcus, you have to stay in the room to make sure the door stays unlocked." I walked out of the diner. The panic was setting in for them now. It wasn't just Arthur. It was the entire ecosystem. The banks that had looked the other way, the politicians who had taken the donations, the architects who had designed the shadows. They were all starting to realize that the quiet man in the corner had been invisible. He'd been a witness. I walked toward the subway. My phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. "He's crying. Jonathan, I've never seen him cry. He keeps asking why you didn't just tell him you were unhappy." I don't recognize the number, likely one of the junior assistants who was still trapped in the blast zone. I didn't reply. Arthur's confusion was the ultimate consequence. He couldn't grasp a world where someone would act out of principle instead of power. He couldn't understand that his greatest mistake wasn't the money laundering or the illegal server. His mistake was believing that my silence was a sign of my insignificance, rather than a measure of my resolve. As I descended into the subway station, I saw a transit cop writing a ticket for a moped parked near the entrance. I smiled, a small, genuine thing. The system was mundane. It was slow. It was often broken. But every now and then it hooked the right bumper. The empire was gone. The building was a hollow shell. And Arthur was finally finding out what happens when the detail man stops paying attention to the dust and starts looking at the man holding the broom. I boarded the train. I wasn't going back to Cold Spring. I was going to the impound lot. I wanted to see them dismantle the server. I wanted to see the ghost finally leave the machine. The visitors' room at the Metropolitan Detention Center smelled of floor wax and desperation. It was a sterile, windowless box designed to strip a person of their context. There was no marble here, no vintage Bordeaux, just a bolted-down plastic table and the hum of a ventilation system that felt like it was recycling the breath of 1,000 broken men. I sat on one side of the glass. I waited for 10 minutes before the heavy door on the other side opened. Arthur walked in. He was wearing the standard-issue orange jumpsuit. It was 3 sizes too large for him, making his once commanding frame look brittle and sunken. He sat down heavily, the plastic chairs screeching against the linoleum. He didn't pick up the phone immediately. He just stared at me, his eyes searching my face for a flicker of the man he thought he knew. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I simply waited. Slowly, he reached for the receiver. I did the same. "You look well, Jonathan," he said. His voice was thin, stripped of the resonant authority that used to command boardrooms. "Better than I do, certainly." "I've been sleeping, Arthur," I replied. "It's amazing how much energy you have when you are managing 2 sets of books." He flinched. It was a small movement, but in the stillness of the room, it felt like a collapse. He leaned forward, his forehead pressing against the glass. "Why the van?" he whispered. "Of all the things, why would you let it end over a rusted piece of junk? You could have moved it. You could have paid the ticket. You knew what was inside that vehicle. You knew it was the heartbeat of everything we built." "I didn't build it, Arthur. You did," I said. "And I didn't let it end. I simply stopped preventing it from ending. You told me the van was urban to breathe. You told me it was beneath my notice. I decided to take your advice. I treated it exactly the way you treated me, as something invisible that would always be there to support your weight." Arthur closed his eyes. A single tear tracked through the deep lines on his face. "I would have given you the world, Jonathan. I was going to name you my successor. The obsidian was supposed to be a monument. A monument to what?" I asked. "To the people you displaced. To the money you moved for men who disappeared, journalists and dissidents. The obsidian isn't a building, Arthur. It's a tombstone for your conscience. You just didn't realize you were burying yourself inside it." He looked up, a flash of the old, manipulative Arthur flickering in his gaze. "They won't be able to hold me, you know. My lawyers are already filing motions. The sovereign entity's status. It's a jurisdictional nightmare. The feds can't prove I knew what was on that server. I can claim plausible deniability. I can claim you put it there." I leaned back, a small, sad smile touching my lips. This was his behavioral signature. Even at the bottom of the ocean, he was trying to find a way to make someone else carry the anchor. "That's the thing about details, Arthur," I said. "They don't just exist in the ledgers. They exist in the physical world. Do you remember the day the van was towed? I stood on the sidewalk and watched you at the window of the penthouse. You were holding a remote, a small, black encrypted key fob. You used it to reset the server node when the signal dipped. Arthur's hand on the phone began to shake. The FBI recovered that key fob from your bedside table, I continued. They also found the proprietary software on your personal laptop. But the most important detail, the van had a dash cam. It wasn't there for safety. It was there for security. It recorded every person who accessed that vehicle for the last 6 months. It recorded you, Arthur, 2 weeks ago, at 2 a.m., when you went down there to manually swap a burnt-out hard drive, because you didn't trust anyone else to touch the hardware. The silence that followed was absolute. Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The untouchable empire hadn't been toppled by a grand conspiracy or a rival mogul. It had been toppled by a man who was too arrogant to realize that he was being filmed by his own security system. I didn't have to frame you, I said. I just had to wait for you to be yourself. You've always been your own greatest witness. What do you want? He hissed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. You didn't come here to gloat. You're too restrained for that. What is it, Jonathan? You want an apology? You want me to tell you you were right? I don't want anything from you, Arthur, I said. I came here because I wanted to see the moment you realized you were no longer in control. I wanted to see the moment the vision finally cleared. I stood up, placing the receiver back on the hook. Arthur began to scream. I couldn't hear him through the reinforced glass, but I could see the veins bulging in his neck. His fists drumming against the table in a rhythmic, impotent fury. He was shouting words I'd heard 1,000 times. Utility, perspective, loyalty. But the words were hollow now. They were just vibrations in a box. I walked toward the exit. The guard opened the door for me, nodding with a quiet respect that Arthur had never managed to earn. Outside, the sun was blindingly bright. I stood on the sidewalk of the Federal Plaza and took a deep breath. The air didn't taste like lilies or new construction. It tasted like exhaust, hot asphalt, and the chaotic, beautiful reality of a city that didn't belong to any one man. I looked at my reflection in the glass of a nearby storefront. I didn't look like a hero. I didn't look like a villain. I looked like a middle-aged man who had finally finished a very long, very tedious job. The Obsidian was being dismantled, piece by piece. The investors were suing, the subcontractors were walking away, and the city was considering converting the skeleton of the tower into affordable housing. It was a fitting end. The monument to ego was being reclaimed by the people it had tried to rise above. I started walking. I didn't have a car waiting for me. I didn't have a press team to manage the narrative. I just had the rest of my life. As I reached the corner, I saw a white van parked near a loading dock. It wasn't rusted. It wasn't a ghost. It was just a van, filled with boxes, and driven by a man who was currently arguing with his partner about where to get lunch. I laughed. It was a quiet, internal sound, but it felt like the first honest thing I'd done in a decade. Arthur was right about one thing. I was focused on the dust. But what he never understood was that when the dust settles, it's the only thing that's left. The finality of justice is often quieter than the movie suggests. There was no gavel slam that echoed through the streets, no cinematic montage of Arthur's assets being auctioned off to the upbeat tempo of a jazz track. There was just a series of signatures, a slow exodus of furniture from the corporate headquarters, and the eventual, heavy silence of an empty room. 6 months after the arrest, I found myself back in the Hudson Valley. The house I'd bought was small, but it sat on a ridge that offered a view of the valley that didn't require an $80 million buy-in. I spent my mornings clearing brush and my afternoons reading books that had nothing to do with zoning laws or capital gains. I was sitting on my porch when a black sedan pulled up the gravel driveway. It wasn't a federal vehicle, and it wasn't a luxury car. It was a mid-range rental. The woman who stepped out was someone I hadn't seen since the trial. It was Claire, Arthur's daughter. She had been the one person Arthur actually seemed to care about, though he had expressed that care by sending her to boarding schools in Switzerland and keeping her at a distance where she couldn't see the grease on his hands. She stood at the edge of my porch, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and a very familiar, inherited wariness. "He wants to see you again," she said. No greeting, no pleasantries, just the message. He's in the infirmary now. The stress. His heart wasn't as strong as he told everyone it was. I didn't invite her to sit. "I've said everything I had to say to him, Claire. He says he has something for you," she countered, her voice trembling slightly. "A final piece of the ledger. He claims there's an account the feds missed. He says only you know how to unlock it." I looked out at the trees. I knew what Arthur was doing. Even now, facing the end of his life in a prison hospital, he was trying to cast a line. He was trying to tempt me back into the shadow world, to make me a collaborator one last time. He wanted to believe that my restraint was just a mask for a greed that matched his own. He couldn't die knowing that I truly didn't want his empire. There is no account, Claire, I said softly. And even if there were, I wouldn't touch the key. Tell him the ledger is closed. She looked at me for a long time, searching for a lie. When she didn't find one, the tension in her shoulders seemed to break. She sat down on the top step of the porch, her head in her hands. He talks about you constantly, she whispered. More than the money, more than the building. He keeps asking, how did I miss him? He's obsessed with the idea that you were a different person than the one he hired. He feels cheated. I wasn't a different person, I said. I was exactly who I told him I was. I was the man who managed the details. He just chose to believe the details meant servant. He cheated himself by assuming his status made him the only person in the room with a soul. Claire stayed for an hour. We didn't talk about the money. She talked about the father she thought she had, and I listened not as an investigator, but as a witness to the collateral damage Arthur had left behind. When she left, she looked lighter, though I knew the weight of her name would follow her for years. The next morning, I received a notification on my laptop. It was a Google alert I'd set for the 57th Street address. The city had officially approved the conversion of the Obsidian. The top 20 floors, the ones Arthur had designed for the invisible elite, were being gutted. They were becoming a public conservatory and a municipal records office. The irony was almost poetic. The space where Arthur had hidden his secrets would now be the place where the city's history was stored for everyone to see. I closed the laptop. I thought about the van. It had been sold at a police auction. I heard it was bought by a young couple who wanted to turn it into a camper and travel across the country. I liked that idea. The vehicle that had been a vessel for billion-dollar lies was now going to be a home for two people looking for the truth of the open road. Justice had been served, but it hadn't brought closure, not the kind people expect. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a profound, lingering exhaustion. I had spent 12 years of my life in the company of a monster, and while I had caged him, the bars were made of my own time. That was the cost. Justice isn't free. It's paid for in the years you spend waiting for the right moment to strike. I walked down to the end of my driveway to get the mail. Among the bills and the junk mail was a small hand-addressed envelope. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It was a picture of the 57th Street curb. The stain from the van was gone. The sidewalk had been power washed, and a small, young tree had been planted in the exact spot where the Icona line had sat for all those months. On the back of the photo, a single line was written in a cramped, familiar hand, not Arthur's, but Sal Vitale's, the tow truck driver. It's a good tree, kid. It's got deep roots. I tucked a photo into my pocket. The world would remember the scandal. They would remember the phantom van and the empire of shadows. They would debate Arthur's guilt and my motives in podcasts and documentaries for years to come. Some would call me a hero. Others would call me a traitor who waited too long to speak. I didn't care about the judgment of the world. I had seen the skyline from the 68th floor, and I had seen it from the gutter. Both views were incomplete. I looked up at the sky over the Hudson. It was vast, indifferent, and perfectly clear. I went back inside and started the fire. I had no more ledgers to check, no more secrets to keep. For the first time in my life, the silence in the room wasn't a space I was filling with observations. It was just silence, and it was enough. They finally understood. I didn't explain further. Some truths don't need witnesses.